I always loved Christmas Eve. The warmth of the lights glowing through frosted windows, the quiet hum of carols on the radio, and the satisfaction of wrapping the final gifts while sipping hot cocoa. But last Christmas Eve changed everything. My husband, Derek, and our 6-year-old daughter, Emily, were fast asleep upstairs. It was nearly midnight, and I was finally getting to unwind after an exhausting day of shopping, cooking, and last-minute decorating. The tree looked perfect, with the star glowing softly at the top. I turned off the TV, about to head to bed, when I heard it, a faint crunch outside, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, my hands still on the remote. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a neighbor's cat, but then the sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was definitely walking outside the house. I grabbed my phone and crept to the front window, careful not to disturb the curtains. Peeking out, I scanned the snowy yard. The street lamp cast long shadows over the front lawn, but nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no movement, just the silent, snow-covered street. Relieved, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe I was just imagining things. But as I turned to head upstairs, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure. They were standing in the far corner of the yard, partially obscured by the hedge. I couldn't make out their face or build, but the way they stood there, motionless, sent a chill down my spine. I hurried back to the window, keeping low. My heart was racing as I tried to decide what to do. Call Derek? Wake him up? Or call the police? But I hesitated. What if it was just a kid cutting through the yard? Then the figure moved. They stepped out from behind the hedge, heading toward the house. My stomach dropped as I saw a second figure appear, then a third. They were dressed in dark clothes, moving with purpose, their faces hidden by scarves and hats. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't random. They were coming here. I bolted up the stairs and shook Derek awake. "There's someone outside," I whispered urgently. He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes, 3 people, they're in the yard. I think they're trying to get in." That woke him up. He got out of bed and grabbed his phone. "Stay here with Emily. Lock the door," he said before heading downstairs. I wanted to protest, to tell him to wait, but he was already gone. I closed the bedroom door and locked it, then went to check on Emily. She was sound asleep, clutching her stuffed reindeer. Downstairs, I heard Derek moving around, followed by the faint sound of his voice. He was probably calling the police. Then I heard it, the sound of glass shattering. It came from the back of the house. My heart felt like it stopped. I clutched Emily's reindeer tightly, my mind racing. The footsteps were louder now, deliberate and heavy. Someone had broken in. I heard Derek shouting something, angry, defiant, but his voice was cut off by a loud crash. Tears stung my eyes as I stood frozen in the bedroom, unsure of what to do. I didn't know if Derek was okay, or if the intruders were heading upstairs next. I grabbed Emily, wrapping her in a blanket and whispering for her to stay quiet. Her sleepy eyes blinked up at me, confused but obedient. I didn't want her to panic, but my own fear was impossible to hide. We slipped into the closet, my heart pounding as I listened to the sounds downstairs. Heavy boots on the floorboards, muffled voices, men's voices. They were ransacking the house. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in the suffocating dark. I tried to focus on keeping Emily calm, whispering reassurances even as my mind spiraled into worst-case scenarios. Finally, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The creak of the stairs. They were coming up. I held my breath, clutching Emily to me as the footsteps grew louder. They paused outside the bedroom door, and then there was a loud thud, once, twice, before the lock gave way. I pressed a hand over Emily's mouth to keep her from making a sound. The intruders were in the room now, their footsteps moving across the floor. I could hear them rummaging through the drawers, overturning furniture. One of them muttered something, and the others laughed. Then one of them spoke, his voice low and menacing. "Check the closet." My heart sank. The closet door flew open, and a beam of light swept over us. Emily whimpered, and I instinctively shielded her with my body. "Get up," the man barked. I obeyed, trembling as I stepped out with Emily in my arms. There were two of them, both wearing ski masks, their eyes cold and hard. One of them held a crowbar, the other a knife. "Where's the guy?" the one with the crowbar demanded. I don't know," I stammered. "Please, just take what you want and leave us alone." The man with the knife stepped closer, his gaze flicking to Emily. "We don't want any trouble. Just tell us where the valuables are." I nodded quickly, my mind racing. "Downstairs, there's a safe in the living room, behind the bookshelf." "Show us," the man with the crowbar said. I carried Emily as they herded us downstairs. The living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, decorations smashed. Derek was nowhere to be seen, and panic clawed at my chest as I wondered what had happened to him. As I pointed out the safe, I heard a sudden noise, a low groan. It was Derek. He was slumped against the wall, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. Before I could react, there was a flash of red and blue lights outside. The sound of sirens cut through the tense silence. The intruders cursed, dropping their tools as they bolted for the back door. Within moments, the police were inside, guns drawn. The men didn't get far. Officers caught them before they could disappear into the woods. I collapsed to the floor, clutching Emily as relief and fear overwhelmed me. Derek was alive, and the nightmare was finally over. But Christmas Eve was never the same. The sense of safety I'd always felt in our home was shattered that night, replaced by a lingering unease. We installed security cameras and reinforced the doors, but I still wake up sometimes, hearing phantom footsteps in the snow. It had taken me over a year to plan my escape. Leaving G was never going to be easy. After 10 years of control, manipulation, and increasingly violent outbursts, I finally found the courage to pack a bag, grab the cash I had been hiding, and drive away in the middle of the night. Christmas Eve seemed like the perfect time. People were busy with their families, the roads were quiet, and I thought I could slip away unnoticed. My destination was a small town 3 states away, where I'd rented a modest apartment under a fake name. But first, I needed to rest. The snow had started falling heavily, and my windshield wipers barely kept up. I spotted a roadside motel with a flickering vacancy sign. It looked shabby, but it was better than risking the icy roads any longer. I checked in under a fake name, Lisa Harper, and the old man at the front desk handed me a key without asking too many questions. My room was small, the heater rattled, and the TV barely worked, but it was warm. That's all I cared about. As I unpacked a few essentials, I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that I was free. I didn't think G would bother looking for me tonight. He'd probably assumed I was at my sister's house for Christmas. He never cared enough to keep track of me, at least until he needed someone to yell at. But then I saw it, a car. It passed slowly by my window, headlights briefly illuminating the snow-covered parking lot. My heart froze. It wasn't uncommon for cars to pass by, I told myself. The motel was just off the highway, but something about the way it lingered, almost crawling, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtain. The car was gone. I laughed nervously at myself. I was just being paranoid. I was brushing my teeth when the knock came. It was loud and deliberate, echoing in the silence of the room. My blood ran cold. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone. Not my sister, not my friends. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I crept to the door, heart pounding, and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My mind raced. Was it just another guest? Maybe a mistake? I told myself to calm down. The old man at the front desk had seemed harmless enough. But when I looked down, I saw them. Footprints in the freshly fallen snow outside my window. They led straight to my door and then back out to the lot. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe I should call the front desk? But what would I even say? I decided to stay put. I turned off the TV, crawled into bed, and kept my phone close. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old building set me on edge. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of a car engine. I jumped out of bed and looked out the window, keeping the curtain barely cracked. There it was, the same car from before idling in the lot. The driver's side door opened, and I saw him, G. Even in the dim glow of the streetlight, I recognized his tall frame and the leather jacket he always wore. My stomach dropped. How had he found me? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, but the operator could barely hear me. The storm had weakened the signal. I managed to say my location before the call dropped. Panicking, I grabbed my bag and considered my options. Running out the front was out of the question. G would see me immediately. I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the snow. He was outside. "Lisa," he called out, his voice dripping with false charm. "I know you're in there. Open the door, sweetheart." I backed away, shaking. He jiggled the doorknob, then knocked harder. "You think you can leave me?" His voice rose, anger bleeding through. "You think I wouldn't find you?" I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon. The chain snapped and the door flew open. G stood there, snow clinging to his boots. His eyes were wild, full of fury and desperation. "You're coming home with me," he snarled, stepping into the room. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You're not doing this anymore." He lunged at me, but I swung the lamp, hitting him across the shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall. "You think you're tough now?" he spat, grabbing my wrist and twisting it until I dropped the lamp. I kicked him as hard as I could, and he fell back, crashing into the nightstand. For a moment, I thought I might have a chance. I bolted for the door, but he grabbed my ankle and yanked me down. We struggled, and I screamed as loud as I could, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. Red and blue lights flashed outside. I heard the crunch of boots in the snow and the shout of a police officer. "Get off her!" G hesitated just long enough for me to break free. The officers burst into the room, guns drawn, and pulled him away. I sat there, shaking, as they handcuffed him and read him his rights. At the station, I learned that the desk clerk had called the police when he saw G lurking in the parking lot. The 911 call I'd made had also partially gone through, giving them enough to send a car. As I sat there giving my statement, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I wasn't free yet. There would be restraining orders, court dates, and plenty of healing ahead, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had a chance. Christmas morning came as I drove away from that town, the snow glistening under the pale sunlight. It wasn't the perfect holiday, but it was the start of something new, and that was enough. It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas Eve shift at Station 32. Most of us had plans for the next morning. Unwrapping gifts, spending time with family, or just catching up on sleep. I didn't expect much action that night, and I was fine with that. But at 11:13 p.m., the alarm went off. "House fire," Captain Nolan announced, already grabbing his gear. "Residential. Possible occupants inside." The words hit like a jolt. Fires with people trapped inside were the calls we both trained for and dreaded. We scrambled into the truck, suiting up as the icy streets sped past. The snowstorm made visibility worse, and the radio crackled with updates. When we pulled up, the fire was already raging. Flames licked at the roof of the modest two-story house, and black smoke poured into the night sky. Snow on the ground glowed orange from the firelight. Neighbors stood shivering in the street, some holding phones, others trying to comfort each other. A woman rushed toward us, tears streaming down her face. "My sister and her son are still in there," she sobbed. "They're upstairs. Please." Captain Nolan didn't hesitate. "Garcia Peterson, you're on search and rescue. Go." Jared Peterson and I grabbed our tools and headed straight for the front door. It was locked, but a couple of swings from my axe took care of that. Smoke hit us like a wall the second we stepped inside, thick and choking. "Fire department, call out if you can hear us," Jared yelled, his voice muffled by his mask. The only answer was the roar of the fire. We moved fast, sweeping the ground floor. The kitchen was already a lost cause. Flames consumed the cabinets and licked at the ceiling. The living room was full of holiday decorations. Stockings hung by the fireplace. A Christmas tree toppled over, its ornaments smashed on the floor. But there were no signs of life. Upstairs, Jared motioned toward the staircase. The heat was unbearable as we climbed. The wooden steps creaked under our weight, threatening to collapse at any moment. We split up to search faster. I took the first bedroom, empty. The second bedroom was a child's room, with toys scattered everywhere. A bunk bed stood in the corner, but no one was inside. "Over here," Jared's voice crackled through the radio. I rushed to the far end of the hall, where he'd kicked open a door. Inside, a woman was crouched in the corner, clutching a little boy to her chest. She looked dazed, her face pale from smoke inhalation. The boy wasn't moving. "We've got them," Jared called over the radio. I knelt beside them, checking the boy's breathing. It was shallow, but he was alive. "We need to move now." Jared helped the woman to her feet while I carried the boy. The hallway was filling with smoke, and the flames were getting closer. We moved as quickly as we could, but every step felt like a gamble. The stairs groaned loudly as we descended. Halfway down, they gave out with a deafening crack. Jared and I barely managed to leap to safety, landing hard on the ground floor with our cargo. "Keep going," Jared shouted, pushing me toward the door. The blast of cold air hit like a blessing as we stumbled outside. Paramedics rushed over, taking the boy and the woman from us. I tore off my mask, gulping the freezing air as the adrenaline started to wear off. "She okay?" I asked, turning to the paramedic. "She'll make it," he said. "The kid's gonna need oxygen, but he's stable." A wave of relief washed over me. We'd done it. We'd saved them. But there wasn't time to relax. The fire was still raging, and other crews were working to contain it before it spread to the neighboring homes. Jared and I grabbed hoses and joined the fight. It took almost an hour before the flames were fully extinguished. By the time we were packing up, the house was a smoldering ruin. The woman sat wrapped in a blanket on the back of an ambulance, holding her son tightly. She caught my eye and mouthed the words "thank you." Back at the station, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to losing them. Fires like that don't leave much room for error. One wrong step, one hesitation, and it could have ended differently. Christmas morning came quietly as we sat around the table, drinking coffee and watching the snow fall outside. There were no gifts to unwrap, no grand celebrations, just the knowledge that, for one family, Christmas wasn't a tragedy this year, and that was enough. I've worked the night shift in the emergency room for years. Christmas Eve is always the toughest. On any other night, the hospital is quiet. People are winding down, heading home to their families. But on Christmas Eve, there's a strange kind of intensity. Everyone wants to be with loved ones, and the hospital is just a stark reminder that life doesn't always care about the season. It was around 10 p.m. when the first call came in. A woman in her late 30s had collapsed in her kitchen. No details, just panic in her husband's voice. "Please, she's not waking up. I think something's wrong. Please hurry," he begged, sounding like he was on the edge of losing control. I grabbed my gear quickly, knowing it would be a while before the full emergency response unit could arrive. As a paramedic, I was the first line of help in situations like this, and this wasn't the time to hesitate. The neighborhood was alive with Christmas lights, reds, greens, and whites twinkling on every house. It should have felt festive, but the cold air felt different tonight. Felt heavier, like something was about to happen that no one could predict. I drove through the familiar streets, glancing at the snowflakes drifting in the headlights, and tried to push the weight in my chest away. When you're in this line of work, the holidays don't always mean what they're supposed to. There's a sickening awareness that something can go wrong at any moment. When I reached the house, I immediately noticed how inviting it looked. There were wreaths on the door and windows, a fully decorated tree visible through the living room window, and a small string of lights hanging from the porch roof. The air should have smelled like pine and cinnamon, but instead, it carried the heavy scent of something burnt. I knocked on the door, and the man who opened it looked nothing like what I expected. His clothes were disheveled, his hair wild, and his eyes were wide with terror. He looked like someone who had seen a nightmare and was still caught in it. "She's in the kitchen," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what happened. She was just making dinner. We were going to have Christmas. She was so excited." I nodded, trying to stay focused. "I'll take it from here. Stay in the living room. Let me work." I made my way to the kitchen. Karen, the woman who had collapsed, was sprawled on the floor just inches from the stove. A half-prepared meal sat on the counter, the smell of overcooked meat mixing with the burnt scent in the air. There were empty wine glasses scattered on the counter, some still half full, one knocked over in her hasty fall. The dishes were left half-washed, and the scene was almost too quiet for someone who had been preparing a family meal just moments before. She had faintly visible bruising along her wrists and neck, signs of something deeper than just the holiday rush or exhaustion. I knelt beside her and checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. Her breathing was slow and erratic, almost imperceptible. Her skin had already taken on a pale hue. I immediately began CPR, shouting for the husband to grab the emergency bag and call the paramedics. Time seemed to stretch as I worked, but it wasn't enough. By the time paramedics arrived, Karen was gone. Her husband, who had been pacing nervously in the living room, stood frozen in the doorway. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something in his eyes now. I don't know if it was guilt or just complete disbelief, but it was there, in the way he wouldn't look at me. He kept muttering under his breath, repeating the same thing over and over. "She was fine. She was fine." The paramedics took over and carefully transported her body to the morgue, leaving the husband with the officer on the scene. I stayed behind to fill out the paperwork. The officer glanced over the medical records on the kitchen counter. That's when we saw it, Karen's history of heart problems. It wasn't listed anywhere in the initial phone call, and it was suspicious that the husband hadn't mentioned it at all when he called for help. "Why didn't you mention this?" I asked the man when we were alone, trying to keep my voice even. "I thought it was just stress. She'd been under a lot of pressure," he responded, looking away. I didn't press further at the time. He looked so defeated, but there was something in the way he avoided eye contact that made me uneasy. It was hard to shake the feeling that something else was at play. Over the next couple of days, the investigation into Karen's death revealed the grim truth. Her death wasn't just a result of her heart problems. The signs were there: bruises, unexplained injuries, and the way her husband had reacted when I first arrived. The police started interviewing neighbors, and the full picture began to unfold. Karen had been living with a man who had been emotionally and physically abusive for years. It had started out subtly, constant criticism, belittling her, undermining her confidence. Over time, his control over her life had tightened. The neighbors spoke of how he would never let her go out alone, how she was always on edge. He had been the one to decide when she could leave the house, when she could talk to people, and when she could take a break. Christmas, a time when people were supposed to feel joy and warmth, was just another reminder of the isolation she had endured. It turned out the evening she collapsed, she had been preparing the Christmas meal, her favorite holiday tradition, the one thing she could control. But as she cooked, he hovered over her, demanding more from her than she could give. And in the stress, her heart gave out. The authorities arrested him soon after. As he was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but think of the image of the Christmas tree in their living room, the twinkling lights contrasting with the dark reality inside that house. Sitting in my car after the shift, I stared at the Christmas lights around me. I had seen tragedy before, but this one hit differently. The holidays were meant to be a time of hope and joy, but for some people, they were just another day to survive. Karen never had the chance to enjoy her Christmas, to have the life she deserved. We all hear stories about abuse, but we rarely talk about how deeply it affects people, even on days meant to be full of warmth and celebration. The holiday season is supposed to be a time of giving, of family, of joy, but for some, it's just another night of surviving. It had been a long week at the station, and as Christmas Eve arrived, I was more than ready for a break. The usual holiday rush had kept everyone on edge, but at least I had a quiet night ahead. My shift was over, and with nothing urgent on my plate, I decided to head home and relax. I had planned to grab a quick bite after work, but I ended up skipping it, knowing I'd be home soon. On my way back, I realized I needed a few last-minute supplies, so I decided to stop by the grocery store. The streets were nearly deserted, save for a few cars on the road. The snow was falling lightly, blanketing the city in calm. The store was practically empty when I walked in, save for a few people gathering their items in a relaxed, holiday-paced manner. I wasn't in any hurry, just trying to grab a few essentials for the night. But then the door slammed open. I turned just in time to see a man burst into the store. He was wearing a heavy coat, and his face was hidden behind a ski mask. In his hand, he was holding a gun. The kind of scene you hope to never see in real life, but here it was. "Everyone down. Now!" he shouted, his voice trembling with panic. People froze in place. I could see their faces, fear mixed with disbelief. Some of them ducked behind aisles, others just stood still, unable to process what was happening. I knew what I had to do. It was Christmas Eve, but for me, it wasn't just another night off. It was an opportunity to do something right, even if it wasn't part of my shift. I stepped behind a row of shelves, keeping my movements slow, controlled. The man was clearly new to this. His hands were shaking as he waved the gun around, trying to force the cashier to open the register. The cashier, a young woman, was trembling, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she fumbled with the drawer. I couldn't let this go on. I pulled out my phone, quickly texting 911. Armed robbery at grocery store, 5th and Oak. One suspect, active threat. I knew the police would be on their way, but I wasn't going to wait idly by. I moved closer to the aisles where the man was pacing. He didn't see me yet, he was too focused on the cashier. I carefully surveyed the situation. The gun was shaking slightly in his hand, and his eyes darted nervously around the store. This wasn't a seasoned criminal. He was a desperate man, scared and clearly out of his depth. I waited for the right moment. As the robber turned to face the other side of the store, I moved quickly. I darted out from behind the shelves and tackled him from the side. My experience as a police officer kicked in, and I was on him in a flash. He struggled, trying to shake me off, but his panic worked in my favor. The gun went flying as we crashed into the aisles, and for a brief moment, I had the upper hand. I pinned him to the ground, using my weight to hold him down, and I made sure my hands were firmly on his wrists, keeping him from reaching for the weapon. "You're not getting away," I said, my voice calm but firm. The man tried to squirm, but there was nothing he could do. He was clearly exhausted, and his fear made him weak. Within minutes, I heard the familiar sound of sirens approaching. The backup was finally here, but by the time the police arrived, I had already disarmed him and kept him subdued. A couple of officers rushed in and took over the situation. They handcuffed the robber, who was now shaking uncontrollably, and one of them nodded to me. "Good job. We had no idea this was happening," one of the officers said, clearly surprised. I nodded. He wasn't exactly the sharpest criminal. Got lucky, I guess. As the officers led the robber away, I stood there trying to process what had just happened. It was Christmas Eve and I had just stopped a robbery in progress. It hadn't been easy, but the adrenaline had kept me focused. The other customers were still crouched behind shelves, some of them still in shock, but everyone was safe. That's all that mattered. I took a deep breath, wiping the sweat off my brow. It had all happened so quickly. The chaos, the adrenaline, the sense of urgency. And then, just as fast, it was over. The cashier thanked me for my quick thinking, and I gave her a reassuring smile. I didn't want any recognition, just another part of the job, really. I stepped out of the store into the cold night, my heartbeat still racing. The city was quiet again, and the snow continued to fall, covering the streets in a blanket of white. Christmas Eve hadn't gone quite as planned, but it wasn't a bad way to end the night. I was looking forward to finally getting home, but I knew something about that night would stick with me. The adrenaline, the fear, the realization that Christmas wasn't just about family and celebration. Sometimes it was about stepping up when needed most.